Thank you, everyone, so much for being with us today. So today's session is a culture of communications, the leadership advantage. My name is Miriam Chamberlain, and I am the event host today. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce the speakers, both Meghan Nichol and Dan Gamble. They're excited to share their perspectives on how building a culture of communications is a leadership advantage in the new world of work, particularly as we all walk down the path towards the future of more distributed, hybrid, and remote work models. Meghan is an experienced HR leader, having built her career with over the past 15 years, primarily in the digital and technology industries. She's currently the head of people at a deep tech company called Redland Technologies, and also founded her own boutique HR consulting firm on the side, where she guides growth organizations through progressive people and culture strategies. Dan is a PR and corporate communications executive whose 16-year career has spanned agency, in-house, and now consulting work, focused on the tech industry across the globe. He began his career in London, then moved to Vancouver 11 years ago to continue to build PR and communication programs for organizations in North America. Most recently, Dan launched DGPR, a consulting agency that delivers strategic communications advice for brands looking to shape the future with clients across Canada, North America, and Europe. Welcome today. So before I just turn it over to our speakers and for us to get started, this is going to be a very engaging session. So we always encourage the audience to put in their comments and questions in the comment section and the chat. I will be joining the presenters today, and it'll be more of a Q&A interactive session. And then the final 10 minutes, we're going to isolate that for full questions. So any questions that the audience has, we're going to address them. And if anyone's brave enough to come on stage, all you need to do is put up your hand, and I will invite you to join us. On a final note, I just want to let everyone know that this session today is being recorded. So we will get started in just a moment. I'm just going to share my screen. We had technical issues last time, so I'm praying that we won't this time.
Excellent.
Oh, can everyone see that? Doesn't seem to be working. Okay, here we go.
There we go.
Perfect. Take it away, guys.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. It's really great to be here, and it's really great to be here with my friend Dan. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Malahat, Esquimalt, and Songhees nations in Victoria, BC. To build on Miriam's introduction, Dan and I worked together for close to a decade and became close allies and partners based on our collective belief that communication is a leadership advantage when done right. So now I think it's important to note that every organization is different. So what's right for one organization does not necessarily mean it will be right for the next. And in addition, there are different things to consider at different stages of the business's growth. So that's what we're here to talk about today, our insights from having worked together and apart over our careers, the successes and lessons we've learned along the way relating to the influence of communication on building culture. Over to you,
excellent.
Dan.
Thank you, Meghan. I'm also really pleased to be here too. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam First Nations in Vancouver, BC. I'm really excited for today's discussion, and I know we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's jump right in.
Excellent. So we thought we'd get started with the 1-minute lightning round of who we are so that you get to know us as people. We are at a people and culture conference after all. So next slide, please, Miriam. So here we are as, we passed the kids one. Here we are in our happy places. So me on my bike, climbing Mount Baker, and Dan in his horse jumping competition. Go ahead. Here's us as colleagues refereeing one of our annual sports days, which we partnered on. It was always a lot of fun. And of course, our obligatory fancy headshots so that you know that Social HR Camp is feeding you legitimate content. So we wanted to kick off our discussion today with a poll. Miriam, please go ahead.
There it is. Okay, so who here has an intentional communication strategy that aligns to your ideal culture?
Miriam, just so you know, I can't see the poll, so I'll let you take that one.
Yep, we'll just give it a couple minutes and then I'll let everyone know.
Sounds good.
So we have a couple votes so far, and so far 100% no.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah, we're still at no.
Okay. Very, very telling. That's insightful. That's good.
Yeah, still no. No strategies.
Okay, good. Well, today hopefully will be a valuable discussion then. That's great.
All right, so let's just dive into some of the questions that we have for the session today. So maybe Megan, you can kick this one off, but how does one go about designing a culture of communication?
Yeah, great question. So, in my experience, a culture of communication sounds like sort of a big undertaking, but my encouragement is that you can start small. You just have to start. So, pick one or two strategies that you can implement in a given time frame, be it a year or a quarter, and make your strategy multidimensional and inclusive so that you cater to different learning and communication styles across the organization. Where I'd probably start is I'd perform sort of an internal audit of what we do now, and then make a wish list from that, so you kind of see what you're missing. And some examples of that could be, we wish to implement a regular town hall where leadership gets to provide an update every month, or it could be maybe we want to implement a technology that enables better and more effective communication across different types of working models, such as remote models. Any of those things could be on our to-do lists. And then I always try to encourage that a culture of communication is not a one-way street. So I try to include various avenues to collect employee feedback along the way, and then be able to action on that feedback. And the collection of employee feedback could be across, various, forums, such as, a survey or employee focus groups, those types of things. But the value of diverse perspectives to address business issues is key.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with all of those points, and I think what can make or break a successful culture of communications within a business really comes down to whether the business truly cares about this kind of evolving collaborative environment that wants to really better itself by putting the team at the center of that journey. So, as Megan mentioned, communications that are top down, they're really one way. And, I think if a business is serious about comms, it really starts with the understanding that communications are open, they're ongoing, and it's a conversation. And of course, conversations can result in a definitive answer that may not be an action or a decision that people want. They won't necessarily please everyone, and they rarely do. But if there's dialogue and if there's an opportunity for people to be heard, you're building that conversation. And I think building that conversation and flow of information is ultimately developing a stronger culture through dialogue. And, I think more and more companies are understanding that you should never underestimate the power of a conversation. But, others, I think, are, still trying to figure that out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one more thought on that, just to wrap that one up, is my advice is always to make sure that there's a system to measure the effectiveness of your communication strategy. And again, strategy is kind of a big word, even if it's just the effectiveness of something that you're implementing that helps to improve communications across the organization, so that you can continue to sort of build a business case for your executive team. And I've seen it done a bunch of different ways, but it can be done by correlating. For example, if you take measure of your employee net promoter score data, you can sort of correlate that potentially to the implementation of certain communication programs over time, and see if, on a chart, the numbers continue to trend up together. So an example there.
Yeah, absolutely. Such an important part is the measurement of it as well. So yeah, that's a great point, Megan. Okay, our next question. What insights would you both share with startup and scale up experiencing, natural growing pains as an example?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
there.
would say, yeah, certainly. So I would say that growing pains are normal and there will be bumps in the road. So kind of to anticipate that and manage your expectations up front. I would encourage us all to embrace the challenges and lessons as organizational development lessons. What did I learn and what could we have done differently? Those types of things. There is definitely not, as I shared earlier, sort of a one size fits all game plan. So my encouragement is to be iterative and agile and kind of learn from the bumps in the road and move on stronger from them.
Yeah. Sorry, Megan.
Sorry, my second thought there was just to center your difficult decisions on your values and communicate that as a way of reinforcing what you stand for. I think it's a really sort of people-centric model, and you can always defend it if you needed to, right? If your decisions are based on your values, people are joining your organization, they're staying in your organization because of that sort of integrity. So, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. To reiterate that, I think, growing pains happen. They're not forever. I think communicating that we're building this business together, we need to pull together to build really strong foundations. And I think the other piece is, remembering that not everyone has been in a startup before that's maybe going through hypergrowth. So reiterate, it's not, this isn't a forever situation, right? But you really need to show those steps that show that there is progress being made. I think the second point when it comes to growing pains is don't forget to put the individual front and center. I think team members need to understand that you get, as a leader, how this growth impacts them within the business, and talk about it, and ultimately show that you're working to fix and move forwards as the business comes together. You need to show the progress as you're moving through that growth phase.
Great. And what about developing a culture of communication during a global pandemic? So, what would you comment there?
Yeah, I think, how timely and relevant, right? I think, building various communication channels into your strategy so that your communications are accessible and inclusive and cater to diverse learning preferences or a distributed hybrid workforce, for example. And then again, I sort of use the approach of building culture and using communications as a tool in that, as we would approach product development as an example. So with this agile methodology, you plan, but you're flexible and pivot as new information becomes available. Already during this pandemic, how many times have we thought, oh, this is just about over. Should we start loosening things up again or reintroducing certain policies into our organization, only to be hit with sort of a new spike or a new variant? So if we remain agile, it makes our lives a lot easier. And I think it reduces anxieties in the organization around that type of change. And then, pardon me, lastly, my encouragement is to rely on data and not sort of emotions or feelings, because during these times, emotions are high and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions and feelings around these things. So to consistently use data to inform and navigate a sensitive time, I think is it's important.
Yeah, and I think all of us have likely hired people remotely in the last 2 years or so, and some of us have hired whole departments or business units virtually. And I think that during this pandemic, really leaning into your corporate values and communicating them during onboarding, through tough times, through good times, helps you make the decision that's the most appropriate through the most relevant communication channel. I think my advice on that one is really put your corporate values front and center, and the rest would follow.
Mm-hmm.
I love that piece about the corporate values. I am curious though, and maybe we can actually ask the audience as well, is to have this a bit more engaging, but has anyone had to address the revisit of corporate values as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the change, what's changed? Has anyone experienced that in the group? Or perhaps even redefining what the corporate values mean to the business because of the ability to be agile at this time?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's for many of the leaders that I've spoken to, it's definitely been a time of introspection. So even if there hasn't been a major change in, let's say, our core values in certain businesses, I think a lot of people are reflecting on exactly as you're saying, Miriam, how do we approach our life and our culture at this organization right now and during this time? And I've certainly experienced that with multiple leaders during this time. Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It almost allowed for the conversation to be revisited again on like the meaning of the values and how it kind of feeds into into the DNA of the culture. So I think it's all very relevant.
Totally. Yeah.
So the next one is like M&As and like mergers and acquisitions and corporate development work. So do you have any advice there?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience, M&A work typically results in a lot of changes internally. So there's sort of a lot of turmoil and lots of changes happening. So I always start with my North Star, which is how will this affect people? What will they need? What do we need to do sort of proactively during and post this transaction to make the best of the situation for the business and the people? So that's kind of where I would start. And then you can build your communications plan and your culture from there. I encourage leaders to provide the big picture as much as possible. So tying the vision of the company to the decision around whatever is happening in the background, be it an acquisition or a merger or an IPO, for example. And at the same time, answering the question, this is probably one of the most important questions I try to ask myself or encourage leaders to ask themselves during times of big transition or change, which is answering the question that I think is on the employee's mind, which is how does this affect me and my role in the organization? So this is, I think, critical during times of change.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, as much as the team or others connected to the business would want you to share information up front, you often are fairly limited in what you're able to disclose and share around times of M&A. So I think be clear on what you can share now and be clear on what you can share later, and give some insight afterwards as to why that's the case, especially if it's a team or an organization that hasn't been through the M&A process a few times. Walk them through what you are able to do so. And I think if you're a company that has that strong culture around communications already, people's concerns and anxiety lessen slightly, because they kind of know what to expect. They know that you're going to walk them through the process. They know that you're going to guide them and share the right info at the right time. So I think speaking to the way that you are communicating in the way that you are really helps people understand where you're coming from. And I've seen that really help companies out over the years if they explain why they're doing it the way that they are.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. And the last one is, developing a culture in high growth business. So, the kind of the startup, startup spaces, sometimes they have hyper growth in such a short period of time. So what insights do you have on that with developing culture of communication in that setting?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I often think that our best lessons come from our experiences during times of growth and change and transformation, as hard as it sometimes is. This is true in life as it is in business. So my encouragement is to be open for leaders and organizations, to be open in their communication with candidates and employees. These are the types of people that are successful in this business at this stage, right? So, and then hire those people that are attracted to that type of stage of business that you're in. Oftentimes in growth stage businesses, we're looking for people that are adaptable, open-minded, that can get their hands dirty and be strategic and have that resilience for all of that change and chaos that's going on. And then I think ultimately at the end of the day, we know that culture isn't about kind of the fun little perks, but rather it's about how we behave and how we communicate with each other, how we feel about our business and the work that we're doing. So I think communicating openly and honestly with employees and with candidates and with your team members ultimately brings out the best in people, even if sometimes it feels hard in the moment.
Yeah. And there was, I've seen it a few times, and Meghan and I were actually talking about it a few weeks ago. I think the Financial Times talked about, a ping pong table not solving corporate culture for a business. And I think, if you're trying to solve or build or develop culture with those smaller perks, the ping pong tables, the free food, or whatever it may be, I think you've got a much bigger challenge ahead. I think ideally you want to listen and share inputs from all corners of the company. Call out suggestions from anonymous surveys and implement them. Answer questions in town halls. Highlight quantitative responses that you've received, and ultimately show the business that you're listening. I think that's the most important part, and then evolve. It's an ongoing journey, and I think you've got to make sure you've got a few tools in place that shows that you're constantly open to feedback and that you're acting on it and moving forward on the insights that you're getting.
Yeah, I love that, Dan. I love the notion of acknowledgement, right? So that's that's really what is extremely helpful, that people are putting in the time to put in their their comments or wanting to put forward their voice. But then where does it go? Does it kind of get lost in space, or does it get acknowledged by the leaders, and then how is it addressed? So
exactly. And if you're not giving that feedback loop, say 2/3 of the company reply on the first study that you do, the numbers just decrease as time goes on. If you're not feeding it back and acting on it, people don't put the time into responding like they did originally. So it's really important that you're feeding it back into the business.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have a couple more questions to get through. So this next one is, what is the most challenging obstacle to building a culture of communication that you worked on together, and how did you navigate it?
Very good question. I would say, walking the fine line between communicating frequently and communicating things of high value. So in my experience, in order to culturalize something, there needs to be frequency and consistency and reinforcement of that practice. And because we all know that in the absence of communication, it can lead to heightened anxieties and these types of things in an organization if they don't have the information they need at the right time. But there are times where I've had leaders feel like they didn't really have anything valuable to update the business on that day, for example. So my advice in that situation is just to stay the course, keep the town hall over canceling it. Even if the message that you deliver is, just a positive reinforcement, let's say, of where the business is at that week, or a new project on the horizon, or, a conversation about, a social issue that's going on that could inspire some passion in your people. So just stay the course so that you're providing that reliability and a leadership touch point along the way. That's my thoughts.
Yeah. And I think also understanding that as much as you want to, there are times when, you're simply not going to have certain parties on the same page. And sometimes you just have to be okay with that as well. I think, as professional communicators and people professionals, I think we often, or I personally, want to please, and I think as we all know, that just isn't the reality sometimes. I think the key in those situations from a comm standpoint, I've always found, is just making sure that your role's really clear, and that share what you were setting out to achieve and outline the steps you've already taken to get you there. Just be clear on what you're responsible for and move forwards. Especially if you've not got total alignment from various groups on how to move forward on something. Outline it, make it clear in terms of what you're trying to do and the work that you've done to get to that point to make the decisions.
It's great advice. Thank you. All right, I think we have another question here. So what are the biggest business impacts from a culture of communication?
Yeah, a few things come to mind. I would say improved performance, and that's both from a business performance and an employee engagement perspective, which are obviously directly interconnected. The better the communication, the faster and more effectively the business can reach its objectives, in my experience and opinion. And again, just to add on to that, my encouragement is to measure this as much as possible. Mm-hmm. I think another business impact is sort of the emergence of cohesive and robust teams, which which yields great personal and professional results, right? Some of my best friends to this day are people I used to collaborate with and I've had the pleasure of working with along the way. And then I would say better ideas as well, right? There's a reason we rely on that quote, 2 minds are better than one. It's that sort of diversity of thought and perspective and experience that takes us a long way in business.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think it's all of that. And on the highest level, I think it just builds a much healthier environment. I think, we can all relate to friendships or relationships that are broken down because communication isn't productive or effective. And I think it's the same in business. You need to really effectively communicate to build and grow and move forwards. And I think, broken communication channels, just in a general sense, don't end well or, go where you necessarily would hope. So, just making sure that they're in place allows the business to perform better and, across all channels. I just think it's really a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both your points there. The other thing I would probably add, and this is just based on my own experience as a people leader, is the notion of trust in leadership, right? So having that trust in leadership, because there is that, continuous feedback, or you're building that culture of continuous and transparent communication. It starts to whether you need to restore it or whether you need to ignite it. It just has that the element of trusting in leadership, which is so critical for all employees, no matter what level of the organization you're at.
Yeah.
And it's also supports and helps retention. So I think it has a big impact on the retention as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Such a good point, Miriam. Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. So what are some of the key takeaways for people today based on many of the things that we discussed?
Yeah, Dan, you start. You kick this one off.
Okay. I'd say don't think you have to have all of the answers all the time. I think, whether it be in a town hall or in a group meeting or even one-on-one, I feel like we always feel that we have to know everything and have all the answers. And sometimes you don't, and that's okay. You can take away the information, maybe go and build a program or go and connect with somebody else and come back. So I think that's the first thing, is that don't feel like you need to know absolutely everything. And I think the second thing is start, if you don't have this big strategic communications plan already, I feel like some people and organizations get stuck and don't start because they feel they've got to have this whole strategic plan and program built before they get going. And I think the key here, and Meghan mentioned it earlier, is just to start small and get going. Build your communications channels from there, and then get more complex and put more and more processes and whatnot in play. But just start the conversation and get moving forward would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Love it. Yeah, building on that, I would say to think about when you're starting to communicate information across the business, to start with your why. So to demonstrate thoughtfulness and build trust, as Miriam was alluding to, it's such an important piece of that tool, of that leadership tool. Said in a different way, it's being in the service of others through communication. So just acknowledging that communication for them is an experience, and it's something that helps build their professional strength, which is great. And then I would say that building various communication channels into your strategy, or just into your efforts, so that your communications are accessible and inclusive and they cater to diverse learning preferences. Building on Dan's point, don't be afraid to fail. Communicating the right thing in the right way at the right time is hard. So you'll get it wrong sometimes. I certainly have, absolutely. But the point is to, just be authentic and humble about what you do know, what you don't know, and be consistent, and you'll get, right back up on your feet there. And then I think the last thing is, to measure the impact of your efforts. I've said it a few times during this presentation, but it's really, really important, especially in this day and age, to use data to inform your future strategies and to be able to tell that story at the executive level. So, I'd wrap it up with that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Some great points there. Thank you. All right. So I think what we'll do right now is I don't see anything coming through the the chat, but if anyone has any questions or anyone want to join us on stage, please feel free to do
Please.
so. Put your hand up. Is anyone brave? Or maybe I'll pick on someone. I don't know. Everyone's freaking out now.
Yeah.
I guess, maybe what I'll do is I'll kick it off with a question, because I did. Thank you very much, both of you, for the presentation today. It was very insightful with getting your insights on building that communication, or building that culture of communication. One of my thoughts is, and I've worked with many executives and leaders, but not all are great communicators. Of course, we probably encountered that. So, what steps do you take to help them, but also help the organization at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Meghan,
Dan?
do you want me to start that one?
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, look, we all have strengths in communicating different ways, right? Some people are amazing at giving a presentation, and others are really good one-on-one. Other people would rather just be behind an email. We all communicate and have strengths in different ways. I think if you're working with a president or a founder that is not comfortable, right? Give them a situation where they are comfortable, because ultimately they're going to perform better. So whether that be a quick update from them at the moment, and then they hand it off to the business unit leaders, right? Or if you know that they like to have their points in front of them, give it to them in a way that makes sense for them. If it's someone that really likes just being on the fly, maybe just give them a pointer or two and let them go with it. But I think it's communications, especially when you're communicating from one to many, it's really personal, and you've got to figure out what makes that person the strongest they can be. I think the other disconnect that can sometimes happen, and I've seen it, and thankfully not too often, but it does happen, is when there's a leader that thinks they communicate and come across in a particular way, but the reality is, or what I hear from the organization, is that they receive it differently. So, it's a subtle line of giving feedback, and there's a bit of an art to it to get the best out of them. I think it would be better if we communicated this way, because I generally hear people like information that way. Give them some soft evidence and feedback that just allows you to shape the program. So make them comfortable, give them the feedback to learn and grow and move forwards, and just be honest about it. I try not to make it this big thing when it comes to having people communicate. It's about just trying to make it as easy and stress-free as possible. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think you guys mentioned it early on in the presentation as well, is the being vulnerable and the acceptance of vulnerability. And sometimes I found too, with coaching and working directly with CEOs and leaders, is you make I made myself vulnerable too. Like I don't have all the answers. We don't always communicate as effectively as we'd like to, but it's okay. Like, it's okay to be that way, and it's okay to be, you can just address those mistakes and move forward from there, and you're learning from them. So that's the positive. That's the consequence of that, right? Is you're learning. So I think that notion of vulnerability is also a very important part there. Meghan, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I tried to model this at the beginning of our presentation, which I think is really important for leaders to do as well in theirs, which is to make it human, to kind of bring that. And it's maybe just building on that vulnerability piece, etc. But it's really like the person up here, even if I'm the CEO or if there's thousands of people in my audience, etc. If you can kind of just like neutralize the audience and the CEO and make a human connection at the beginning, it goes a long way to provide comfort, to provide connection. So yeah, I always try and throw a little bit of that in at the beginning as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions coming from the audience at all? Oh, sorry. Something is happening here. I think I'm good. So we do have, we're a little bit early, but I'm just wondering if we had any more questions or any more thoughts or comments that we'd like to share.
Yeah, any thoughts or comments, or I'd love to just hear if anybody's got any personal experiences that they've had at their organizations where communications, again, just tools or strategies or anything has worked or hasn't worked, or.
I think a comment that I'll throw out there too is, how do we solicit what people want, right? So we talked a lot about, you mentioned surveys, and we put those surveys out for team members. Um, maybe, like, I'd love for you guys to share your experience on, like, what kinds of questions do we ask the team on what style of communication they're looking for, what means of communication they're looking for, what are they craving so that they can thrive within their roles.
Yeah,
I
it's such.
can
Yeah, go for it.
Megan.
No, you go.
I would say it's I think when you've got a comms person and a people person in an organization, generally speaking, I would say that those two people are likely the most plugged in people in terms of temperature within the business, right? They know what's working, how the departments are feeling, what people's feedback on recent programs are, like they know, they just inherently know. So which allows you then to go back and ask the right questions, right? So and I think getting the tone right really depends on the temperature in the company at that time. For example, if it's just after bonus season in December or January, whenever your organization does it, you may get a different response to, if the bonuses were good, you may get a very different response to whether they would recommend the business to, others versus, if there's been an M&A that shook the business, you're going to get a different response at that time, right? So I think it's about really feeling your way out in the environment and then tailoring the questions accordingly. I am a big fan, though, of like an annual study of quantitative questions that allow you to do that gut check and temperature check for you. But I think the best responses I've always seen companies get is when they really hit the nail on the head in terms of asking the right questions at the right time, depending on what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. And I also find too that investing in context when you're asking the question, it just brings so much more value to getting that accurate response from people, because they understand what the intention of that and why you're asking the question.
Exactly.
That whole investment in context. So, Meghan, anything to add? Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I agree with all those points. And I think just before we wrap up, I hope everybody took some value out of the conversation. And most importantly, again, we sort of said this culture of communications, and it feels like a big undertaking. But most importantly, our hopeful takeaway is that you can just start small and sort of build from there. But just know that is a leadership advantage for you to be able to build on. Yeah. And thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That was great. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. Meghan, Dan, love your friendship. Love everything that you offered us today. Thank you so much.